Welcome to the Liberty Insider. This is the program bringing you news, views, and information, and indeed insight into religious liberty in the US and around the world. My name is Lincoln Steed, editor of Liberty magazine, and my guest, Gregory Hamilton, president of the Northwest Religious Liberty Association, and my sometimes debating friend. Welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
You know, we're sitting in a studio that's in Illinois, right?
You're a friendly debater, Lincoln, by the way. It's all cool.
Good. At least we can shake afterwards. But, you know, we're in Illinois now. Isn't that the land of Lincoln?
Yes, yes. I love it.
And I don't take it personally. I was not named after Abraham Lincoln.
Well, you're from Australia, so you don't probably appreciate it as much as I do. I love the land of Lincoln, thank you.
It works in my favor, though, because I was named Lincoln after a spoon my parents had that was Lincoln brand. That's most cool. Americans don't realize there's the town of Lincoln, played heavily in the Wars of the Kings, Lincolnshire, Lincoln Green.
Yes.
But we'll talk about Abraham Lincoln. Father Abraham, as he was known during the...
And it's timely because we recently celebrated President's Day.
Right. And also, we're not too far removed from Black History Month. I've been dealing with that on Liberty magazine. And he played a central role, of course, as president with the Emancipation Proclamation during the Civil War. But what do you think of Abraham Lincoln? And don't apply it to me, but Lincoln, what do you think of Lincoln?
Well, you know, I first think of Lincoln in a statement that it's a speech he gave at Edwardsville, Illinois in September 13, 1858. And he said, "Familiarize yourself with the chains of bondage, and you prepare your own limbs to wear them. Accustomed to trample on the rights of others, you have lost the genius of your own independence and become the fit subjects of the first cunning tyrant who rises among you." Now, this was sort of the beginning of Abraham Lincoln's real rise of consciousness regarding the plight of the African American. For many years, he had thought, well, if they just establish a separate state or colony in which all African Americans could live, or they could be sent to a country in Africa, okay, where they could all live peacefully and be free there, or, you know, this and that, and all kinds of theories came up. But then when Dred Scott decision was passed was ruled on by the Supreme Court that declared that black people, African Americans, essentially were not people. They were not persons. They were slaves. They were people of bondage. And therefore, the 3/5 clause in the Constitution saying that slaves represented 3/5 of a person for purposes of apportionment so that states could have equal representation at the federal legislature.
Well, not quite equal, but give them a weight commensurate with these extra persons.
And so because the population in the South was not big, it was large farms, large plantations, not a big population. So they wanted equal representation as much as possible. And so when that decision came down, basically affirming the original intent of the founders, which was accurate, Lincoln was incensed about that because he said, you know, aren't you awake to the times? Don't you understand that the slavery system is going to run amok, that it's going to create a total collapse of our economic system in this country? And so he was getting more agitated and was getting more and more pressed to run for president of the United States. He had failed in running for State House like 3 times, even though he won several times.
He had a checkered career.
He ran for Congress like 4 times and only got in once for 2 years, and then was ousted after his famous speech where he declared that the Mexican-American War was a wicked war and that President James Polk was an evil president. And so it got back home in the newspapers back in Springfield, Illinois, and they ousted him. They said that's politically incorrect. That's intolerable.
My take on Abraham Lincoln is that, as you've said, other times on the framers of the Constitution, of course, much earlier than him, that he was a product of his times.
Yes.
And you can't remove him from that.
Yes.
I think he reflected his times in many ways, but he had a growing moral consciousness that brought him in conflict with his time. I've read his speeches, the debate with Douglas, wasn't it?
Yes.
And in particular. And he made some horrendous statements that would get him fired nowadays about non-whites. I mean, he said, you and I, neither one of us want to live next to such people, right? And I don't think he was just saying that for them. What I think is
and yet he had great compassion for them because...
Well, he was a person of deep morality.
He got in a few fist fights defending black people in Springfield.
I think as a level of human beings, he saw a great injustice. And more and more he was determined to stop it, right? But there's an incredible telling episode not long before his assassination where a deputation of the black leadership came to his office and they were thankful. They came to thank him. And you know what he said to them? He says, since you are the proximate cause of this war, you should leave this country.
Yeah, no, I recall that. Yes.
And yet at the same time, you know, he risked the whole Union.
Yeah.
In some ways over this issue. If he had publicly endorsed slavery as he became president, he could have diffused it. Although it's really the other way around. His mere election guaranteed the Civil War because he was already so much on record as opposing the aims of the South and so on.
Oh yeah, the South was very mindful of that fact, and they were very upset with his election, and they thought this was the end of the world and we have to do something about it, essentially.
So you know, he was a man of great justice, and yet the great irony is, as the Civil War was going hard, as a strategic matter, he freed the slaves in the South, not in the North.
That's true. In fact, much of the Jim Crow laws and the black codes that followed, black code laws first and then the Jim Crow laws later, prior to the Civil Rights Movement, all of those laws were basically modeled after laws for African Americans that existed in the North. Right. This separate but equal type philosophy that promoted segregation.
So my point, after throwing the dust everywhere, is let's give him full and absolute credit as in spite of being a man of his times, he had the moxie to tackle this nettlesome issue that even today haunts the United States.
But think about it.
He did it from a point of morality, but as a citizen of his times, he was a mixed bag, as you'd expect.
But he risked his reputation as president, even re-election, to fight for the Emancipation Proclamation Act, which he put forward in 1863,
well, I
a
read
year
some
before
of
his
the debates
re-election.
with his cabinet and that. It wasn't cut and dried.
No, of course
he had
not.
a very, times almost cynical attitude to all of
Of course.
and had to be pushed.
Of course. In fact, he had a philosophy that if the Emancipation Proclamation, by putting it forward, it gave the North a sense of moral superiority over the South. It was a means, a practical means of inspiring the troops to, you have a cause to fight for. In other words, don't lay down. Don't just think you can have a few skirmishes. In fact, he had a problem with some of his generals, including General McClellan, who was the head of all the forces, who thought, well, if we just win a few skirmishes here and there, we'll settle, and the South will become a southern United States, the North will become the northern United States. He says, no, we have to utterly annihilate the South in order to restore the Union. That was Lincoln's philosophy, and you can read this in James McPherson's book, his Pulitzer Prize-winning book called Tried by War, Lincoln as Commander-in-Chief. It's a great book, and I encourage you to read it because what it demonstrates is that Lincoln, from his teenage years on, would go to the library and he would borrow these books on the life of Napoleon, Prussian generals, other generals. I mean, this guy was so well read in terms of war strategies and battle strategies, more so than even the commanders who had gone to West Point.
Well, that was his, you need to be careful, that was his judgment. And you and I have lived through a few presidents that believed that they had strategic knowledge.
I know, presidents who can go overboard. But Lincoln was...
The history books have been very kind to him, as though McClellan, wasn't it, and others were just lazy commanders, and that they didn't do what Lincoln wanted. They might have had good military reasons for their course.
That's why he found in Grant and Sherman, you know, Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman, generals.
And a war criminal and a boozer.
Now be careful. Ulysses S. Grant is my relative now. And
no, I'm mischaracterizing.
Historians are elevating Grant right now to great prominence because they didn't truly understand. He was a man of few words. He was very quiet, like
he was a bulldog.
Yes, he was very persistent.
Yeah.
Yes.
I've studied the Civil War at great length.
Yes.
It's very interesting. But like all history, it takes on to one-dimensionality if you're not careful.
I want to focus on Lincoln's father, Thomas Lincoln.
Yeah.
It's very interesting the way Lincoln grew up. You know, Lincoln's father was a homesteader, and he tried to homestead in West Virginia, then Kentucky, and then Illinois. And he failed in all places. And his father was very much into Jeffersonian economics, this idea that agrarianism was the answer to everything, that you could be self-supporting, self-sufficient, and it didn't work. He failed every time. Because that economic system, even though it seemed good in and of itself, small farms never quite made it. Big farms always made it, but small farms didn't. And so the homesteader economy, Lincoln said, was ridiculous. It was a failure. He admired his hard scrabble, his rough-knuckled father and his sweet mother. But he understood that in order for a country to thrive, you have to have a banking system that corresponds with all facets of the economy, in which the economy was revved up through commercial industry and industrialism, that it couldn't just be the cotton farmer or the agrarian farmer or the plantation owner that sustained the economy. What he saw was an economy that would fail ultimately with a Southern system that insisted on slavery as the backbone of its economy, which would drag the rest of the nation, the North being the industrial North, would drag both down into not only economic collapse, but the ruinization of their nation. In fact, even up to that day, Britain still had aspirations, even up to 1860, had aspirations of taking over North America.
Retaking it, yeah.
Yes, and they saw the weakness. They kept looking for weakness, and they were ready to seize it back. Lincoln knew all this. Lincoln studied this. And so when you look at the Civil War, there were all kinds of factors involved.
Well, and you can make a good argument that it wasn't just the South's agitation and in particular slavery. The U.S. was getting a little large for the old system to control. It was becoming rambunctious. And the move toward industrialization, of course, was creating this divide between the agrarian South and the North. Something would have happened anyway. If it hadn't been slavery, I believe, in fact, I have an aspirational view of history. I think if Lincoln had lain it down and not precipitated civil war, I think the U.S. would have fragmented into at least two sovereign areas. And it could have done it peacefully. Whether it would have fulfilled manifest destiny, that's another question.
We forget that the Civil War, even the whole concept of the Civil War, was unconstitutional.
That's what I think. You should put it there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so Lincoln was taking a huge risk.
Yeah.
He was called a lawbreaker, a man who was against the Constitution, a revolutionary that was evil, abominable. I mean, this is the way the South painted him. And in some respects, they could legitimately say that, okay, in a sense that in terms of understanding the Constitution, in terms of the interpretation of original intent, that's why original intent in the long run, you almost have to throw out the window at times, not altogether.
It's dangerous because they might have had some bad intention, not necessarily written in the Constitution. But we know the factions at that time, and you don't want to reach back into old factions.
And not only that, but if the South grows by eliminating slavery, it causes the South and southern cities to grow. So I mean, and with southern cities growing, what do you have? You have more representation at the federal legislature, and so he knew that the economic system would sustain itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I see you did a double take and noticing that we're a little past our halfway time, so let's take a break. We'll be back shortly to continue this interesting revisionist discussion. Welcome back to the Liberty Insider. Before the break with guest Greg Hamilton, we were going hammer and tong on the Civil War and what caused it and
the life of Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, but from the perspective of Abraham Lincoln. But we got onto the Civil War, and of course you can't really discuss him with it. I mean, his life was long, but his presidency and his presiding over the Civil War, and of course he was assassinated before. Really,
we remember his ideals more than we remember his pragmatism, and the reason why, you know, he had to do the things he did. As you said, he was a man of his times, and I think of one of his idealistic statements that I quote in my book called Soul Liberty, Celebrating America's First Freedom, which you can get on Amazon.com. And Lincoln says, "Those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves, and under a just God cannot long retain it." So he actually believed in a deep sense that ending slavery was not just God's will, but it was a way to not only save the nation, so to speak, both economically and otherwise, but also to restore the original intent of the Constitution, which to him meant making basic rights accessible to women, to minorities, including a lot of poor whites who were still treated like chattel and in a way almost as slaves themselves, okay? And what I mean is the poorer class, or what was known back then as known as today, the same name my grandpa used to give it years ago, called them white trash. Now that's terrible to say that, but that's in fact the way it was. And so Lincoln wanted to make
they used to say the underclass.
The underclass. But Lincoln wanted to make sure that everyone had access to the Bill of Rights, to their basic human rights.
No, he had some very egalitarian views, but as I've said and you repeated, I think he was a person of his times. You mentioned his comment on God and justice. You know, he was the one that said that both sides had prayed to God and they couldn't both be right.
That's right.
Well,
that's because both the North and the South claimed Scripture for their justification.
Right.
And that leads us to the discussion of William Garrison. You see, Abraham Lincoln really believed that the abolitionist movement, even though they had a good cause, he thought they were too radical, too extreme. Lincoln did not want a civil war. He did not want a civil war. He thought that it was probably inevitable, but he didn't want it. And so he had a hard time linking himself to the Christian right of his day, the abolitionist movement. Yet in the end, it was Lincoln coming together in a wedding, so to speak, of ideals that brought them together to produce or to fight what's called the Emancipation Proclamation Act of 1863, which was later, of course, voted on by Congress and made law and ratified by all the states in 1865, after his death.
Well, yes. I'd put it another way. A civil war, you know, is a very desperate, violent family feud. And as the violence heats up, the issues sort of polarize, and I think that's what happened. We know that John Brown, who represented the radical fringe of the abolitionist movement, was really the fuse that lit the conflict. And as it sharpened and became more bitter, naturally their position would come closer to Lincoln's, if not his views, then his need, his political need.
I've often found it interesting to watch how extremists drive moderates to take a more firmer stand on subjects
happens all the time.
And issues, and that's fascinating in terms of a political dynamic.
We're seeing it right now in the United States.
Oh, absolutely, yes. And there's very few moderates left, and they need to speak up and rise up and be counted.
Yeah, and the moderates get shamed into their moderation. as the system appears to be polarizing.
Yes.
Very dangerous time.
Oh,
and
yes.
and the Civil War was a dangerous time. I don't think it was a great thing on any level. The abolition of slavery came out of it, but I think you could make very good arguments that if they'd ridden that out, slavery would have died a natural death not too far distant.
Well, that's what Robert E. Lee argued, the general for the South. But in fact, that was the argument of Thomas Jefferson, that they hoped that it would
oh, yeah.
die a natural
it took
death.
Longer than they thought.
Yeah, much longer.
But by the time of the Civil War, the machinery for first of all, cotton was changing in its dynamic anyhow, but the machinery to harvest it was becoming more mechanized. So there was not even the need.
Robert E. Lee even argued, I just read a biography of Robert E. Lee, a big old fat book, about 900 pages, and it talks about how he cited the constitutional separation of church and state as the reason why the North, specifically inspired by abolitionists, to basically make a moral judgment upon them and say that slavery must be ended. He said, he says, it will probably die a natural death, but you don't have a right to intervene in our sovereign state's rights to do what we think is best. And so therefore he cited the constitutional separation of church-state, why the Civil War was unjust and immoral, which I find fascinating because in fact Lincoln took a big risk being called immoral, being called all kinds of names for moving forward this war. I mean, if you think about how many lives were lost, 660,000 lives, the largest loss of lives combined of any war in American history, foreign or home. And I find that interesting because Lincoln wasn't fighting an immoral war, he was fighting a war of justice.
I think you can argue that case. You're bringing it close to what I'd mentioned to you in between times. I just read an article recently about the morality of sovereign states and their wars and dynamic between states. And it's very hard to point to an absolute legal morality of states, how they act toward others. Even when they murder millions of people to enlarge territory or whatever, in the past, it's not been on this pure moral state that you're attributing to Lincoln. Really, it's might makes right, and if it's in the national interest, fine. It's only when they lose a war, that we have the Nuremberg trials typically. But I think as Christians, we need to recognize, and I think on that level, Abraham Lincoln is due some credence, that he did sort of insert a personal morality, not always consistent. It's the only explanation, or else I don't think history could be kind to him, because he was willing, basically, as Hitler in his worst days was willing, to sacrifice the whole nation to get his way.
Well, and you look at the 66th Congress, which was basically the radical Republicans post-Civil War that came up with the 14th Amendment. They gave us the Due Process Clause, the Equal Protection Clause, and so on. And if you look at that movement, they were radical Republicans who wanted to make sure that the South, to be admitted back into the Union, abided by the Constitution. And they wanted to make sure that the Southern people had access to the same rights as the other states did in the federal Constitution, specifically in the Bill of Rights. Mm-hmm. And so what they did is they came up with an incorporation doctrine, which was that the South had to, in other words, the Bill of Rights was intended also at the state level. It wasn't just intended to be obeyed or executed by the federal government, that it had to also be put forward by the southern states who didn't allow for human rights or basic civil rights forwarded in those same Bill of Rights. And so they made sure that the supremacy clauses of Article 6, Sections 1 and 2 of the Constitution, which were originally there when the founders signed off on the Constitution, the South never really fully agreed to those, what's called the supremacy clauses.
I don't think
that is, the South had to abide by federal law, and this idea that...
I don't think all the states quite saw it that way.
Well, this idea that states were ultimately sovereign was a misnomer, and really, the Civil War decided that once and for all.
You're right.
That states...
The war decided it, but I don't think it had been decided in the Constitution.
Right. states could not nullify any law that the federal government came up with. After the Civil War, that became clear. The supremacy clauses of Article 6, Sections 1 and 2 made that clear. When we examine the life of Lincoln, we have to understand that he fought a just war.
If you hunt, you can still find spirituals that mention Father Abraham. Abraham Lincoln earned his sobriquet honestly as the president who signed proclamations that ended slavery. As a president, though, he was definitely very controversial. His religion itself was challenged because he was not an Orthodox Christian. But in many of his personal dealings, he exemplified a morality that we still wonder at. How he came at that is a mystery, but it is no question that great men like Abraham Lincoln have changed and determined the courses of nation for centuries. But rather than look at great men as something unique or divinely inspired, recognize that, like all of us, they challenge their deficiencies and reach toward the divine for their true help. For Liberty Insider, this is Lincoln Steed.